Our speaker tonight will focus on a topic he knows very well, the battle for Rabaul. Bruce is a graduate of Penn State University. He received his commission following training at the Naval Air Training Station in Pensacola, Florida. Most of his service time was spent in Cold War aerial operations. Bruce's father was a B-29 pilot during World War II, and he had an uncle who was a navigator on a B-17 that operated out of New Guinea in the Southwest Pacific during the war. I think he's going to provide a very engaging and interesting account of all the fighting around this mighty Japanese naval base on New Britain Island in the Southwest Pacific. So would you please welcome Bruce Gamble.
Thank you very much, John. It's a real privilege for me to be here. It's nice to return to the Minneapolis-St. Paul area after about 12 years. I was here at an air show in the summer in 2002, I think, and had a great visit. So it's really nice to be back. I want to thank Don Patton and all the others on the board of the Harold Deutsch World War II Roundtable for giving me the opportunity to come and share a little bit of World War II history with you. As John mentioned, I come by my World War II interest honestly, with a dad who was a B-29 pilot, an uncle who was a B-17 navigator, both in the Pacific. I was also kind of drawn to World War II because of my birth date, which is December 7th. This happened to be the 17th anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1958. It was kind of a difficult birth. My mother calls it the night of infamy. And so between that and where I was raised in central Pennsylvania in an old historic house and all kinds of other things, I really developed a very strong interest in history. My service in the Navy led me to, the background, gave me the authenticity to write about war in the air. Not that I ever faced any bullets or flak or any of those things, but in training, and I have a squadron mate who was part of that, who's here in the audience tonight, we did things like basic fighter maneuvers and even advanced fighter maneuvers, so I know what it feels like to be in a high G environment where you're trying to chase a bogey or having one chase you. I have some familiarity with those things, and of course spent 8 years in the military, so I have that background. This is a squadron or a crew photo. In the A3, we had a crew of 7, including linguists and electronics experts. This is going off the angle deck of the USS Carl Vinson in about 1983. It was a big jet, biggest operational aircraft that the United States Navy has operated. Not to detract from the C-130s that made a couple of test landings and that sort of thing, but the A3 was operational for many years aboard carriers. I also have flight time in a warbird. In 1987, ABC came to Pensacola to shoot War and Remembrance, the sequel to Winds of War. And I had an opportunity, because I was in the operations staff at the training wing, to sign on as an extra. So I got paid $100 by ABC to go on 3 flights in the SBD-5-5 flown by the Chino Air Museum. The pilot was John Mahoney. That may be a name familiar to a lot of you who are around warbirds. And that's yours truly in the back seat playing around with those twin 30s. The photograph was taken by a guy in the back seat of a T6 or an SNJ. And we went out and flew over to Lexington and shot all the battle scenes for that miniseries. It was a great experience. We're going to jump right ahead now into the background and some scene setting for Rabaul. When Don invited me to give this talk, he was pretty specific on wanting me to set the stage and explain why Rabaul was important. Rabaul, which is about 1 square mile, maybe 1.5 miles square, was fought over for 44 consecutive months from early 1942 until the end of World War II. And there's no other town, city, regional thing like that had such a length of of warfare during World War II. The map here, fairly self-explanatory, but hopefully you can figure out which one is Australia, even from the back of the room. Really, it's the linchpin of this whole area was Australia, and for the Allies, keeping Australia in the fight. And that's why Rabaul ends up being so important. New Guinea is a really critical part of the Southwest Pacific fight, as we'll learn a little later on. The other parts we're going to zoom in now on would be the Solomon Islands and the eastern part of New Guinea. So now on the left of the screen there, you can see what they call the Papuan Peninsula of New Guinea, which has the Owen Stanley Mountains forming a kind of a spine. Those mountains go up to 13,000 feet. And from the south coast of New Guinea, where there's a red circle around Port Moresby, to the north coast of that peninsula is only about 100 to 125 miles. So to have a mountain range at 13,000 feet right down the middle of that is pretty dramatic. In the center of the screen at the top is Rabaul, actually at the northern part of New Britain. And it's got a red dot around it so that you can find Rabaul. New Britain is the crescent-shaped island there in the center of the screen. Then we have the Solomon Islands going down to the southeast from New Britain. And as many of you know, there were many critical battles fought in the Solomons. Now to just zoom in a little bit, again, once more, at the very northern tip of New Britain is Rabaul. And you can see here from the shape of the island, one of the most interesting features about this part of the world. We've all heard about the Ring of Fire, the Pacific Rim, and all of the volcanoes there. And Rabaul was a spectacular example of volcanic activity. You can discern right in the middle of that the two big bodies of water there, both actually oval shaped, where you see Blanche Bay and Caravilla Bay down in the lower part, and then Simpson Harbor right in the center of the screen. Well, those are actually part of two overlapping giant calderas. And a caldera is a feature that's created by multiple volcanic eruptions. And a subterranean volcanic eruption results in sometimes untold cubic miles of magma and other debris being ejected up out of the surface of the earth. So a caldera is formed when that magma leaves and then there's an empty chamber. And that chamber's thin roof can't support its own weight and it collapses. And then in this case, when that happened over who knows how many millennia, the sea flooded in and created these magnificent deep harbors. And it left this craggy peninsula around the northern part with all those craters on it. And then those are actually extinct and a combination of extinct and semi-active volcanoes. And it's called Crater Peninsula. So surrounding Rabaul are 5 or 6 volcanoes. The harbor itself is a collapsed caldera. It gives you a little bit of an idea of the volcanic past that formed it.
Slide chain.
It was a Stone Age place until the discovery of copra, or copra, depending on how you pronounce that, the process of using the oil from coconuts to create soaps and candles and other things. When the Europeans discovered that process, the Southwest Pacific and the South Pacific became a developed area quite rapidly. The Simpson Harbor area and Rabaul share a combination of Anglo and German background. Simpson Harbor was named after a Royal Navy captain who named it after himself, and he named Blanche Bay after his ship, even though other explorers had actually, quote unquote, discovered the area 100 or more years earlier and even done some mapping. Then the Imperial German government set up a headquarters to control the territory. Initially, they set it up in New Guinea. It was plagued with malaria and other diseases, so they moved to New Britain and initially set up along one of the bays, and then an engineering group came in and actually drained the north end of a big mangrove swamp and engineered a town. They built a town literally from the ground up, beginning around 1904. They built a wharf first, and then from the ground up they built a small city. It was called Rabaul, which was a native extract for place of mangroves because of the swamps they had drained. And they built really handsome, strong European buildings with a German influence. This is the New Guinea Club, which was for the wealthy and upper class whites at I would say by 1915 or so, there were a couple of hundred whites, not many more, and Asians coming in because the trade, the commerce was bringing in lots of Asians and other fortune seekers from all over Asia. In 1914, at the beginning of World War I, with Australia entering the war, they sent a naval expeditionary force from Sydney Harbor up to Rabaul. They landed this small expeditionary force, and in a small gunfight, they captured a German radio station. And the first 5 casualties for Australia who were killed in action in September of 1914, right after the war began. So with the surrender of Rabaul to Australia, it was in Australian hands throughout the war, and then in 1921 became part of the mandated territory of New Britain, an Australian mandate, which was issued by the League of Nations. Rabaul was the capital of the mandated territory, but there were problems with the volcanoes, and in 1937 there was a devastating eruption right in Simpson Harbor. One island literally grew right up out of the harbor overnight in an eruption. A 700-foot conical volcano just grew right up out of the harbor floor. And then another volcano right across from Simpson Harbor erupted that same day. About 500 natives were killed by the pyroclastic flow. 1 or 2 whites were lost in that, and the town was buried in wet ash, and they almost abandoned it, but over a period of years they were able to restore the town. In 1941, with the war going on in Europe, Australia was committing almost all of her resources to helping Mother England in North Africa and elsewhere. They really didn't pay much attention to their own backyard until it was almost too late. And in the summer of 1941, 3 small garrisons were sent up to man some of the island territories just north of Australia in the New Guinea area. One of these was called Lark Force. It was approximately 1,500 personnel, so that you can get a feel for what they had. An infantry battalion, some support groups like an anti-tank battery. I will point out while you're reading that with those little 2-pounder guns, they did not have any explosive shells. They only had solid steel shot. Not much good against much of anything. And they only had about 9 rounds per gun. The field ambulance was a group of 2 dedicated surgeons, doctors, and some very well-trained orderlies whose role was quite important. The militia detachment was called the New Guinea Volunteer Rifles, and they were basically planters and businessmen and tradesmen who trained as a volunteer militia, just like the name would exemplify, and they served in this battle. And I also want to point out the militia anti-aircraft battery. They had 2 aged guns, 3-inch guns, one of which had a cracked breech. So they didn't fire the guns for practice. What they did was tracked the mail plane that came in every Saturday and pretended to shoot it down. And when it took off after unloading the mail, they tracked it again as it took off and pretended to shoot it down. That was their training for the militia. But as you'll see, their training turned out to be fairly effective. The first independent company listed at the bottom were the Commandos. These guys were up in New Ireland and had a small unit up there to garrison Caviang Harbor in New Ireland. I'm going to just flash through a couple of photos here. This is the battalion officers at Rabaul in Victoria during their training there in southern Australia. The very dour-looking individual was Colonel Jack Scanlon, who was the commander of the New Guinea area. In other words, he commanded all of Lark Force and the 1st Independent Company and the militia, the whole area, extending to the islands around New Britain. The reason why he looks so dour, if I remember this in a little bit, I'll explain the look on his face. And then the other photo at the bottom of the page shows what the Aussies called square bashing, where they would march around the parade ground in a square pattern. And they just called that square bashing. So when they marched and did their drill, they stepped off smartly. In addition to the infantry and artillery and other units, there was a composite squadron, 24 Squadron, Royal Australian Air Force, which had 4 Lockheed Hudsons. I believe in the Commonwealth they were called Bostons. And there you can see the performance and armament and such. It was a light bomber, not capable of a whole lot either in range or hitting power. The squadron also had 10 of these Commonwealth Aircraft Corporation, CAC, Wirraways. Anybody recognize this? You can say it out loud. T6, SNJ, you bet. It was actually just a license-built trainer, 2-seat trainer. In the Royal Australian Air Force at the beginning of World War II, which was a very poor, economically poor service, this was a frontline fighter. They had 3 machine guns, 2 in the nose, 1 in the back seat, just rifle caliber bullets, and a crew of 2.
Slide change.
The Japanese wanted Rabaul from even before the attack on Pearl Harbor. They had their sights set on Rabaul specifically. In the military orders written in the summer of 1941, Rabaul is identified as a specific goal of what the Japanese called the Southern Offensive. The reason is the spectacular harbor, which could shelter an entire fleet of ships, in addition to which the location of Rabaul was very ideal for controlling a large area of the Southwest Pacific. To the Japanese, it's considered the southeastern area. We look at it as the Southwest Pacific, but the Japanese actually called it the southeastern area because of its relative position to the home islands. But they wanted Rabaul, and they set up a program to capture Rabaul as part of the Southern Offensive. So its importance can't be understated, that they were already planning this before the attack on Pearl Harbor commenced. So, with Admiral Yamamoto, who was designing that attack, there were other attacks being designed. The attacks on the Philippines and on Malaya and Rabaul. In early January of 1942, land-based bombers from Truk up in the Caroline Islands, about 700 miles north of Rabaul, began some softening up preliminary bombing. It began on January 4th, a Sunday, with a raid in the morning by some land-based twin-engine medium bombers. It was followed up that afternoon by an attack by some huge flying boats, big 4-engine Kawanishi Mavis flying boats. After about 2 weeks of this, with periodic attacks, 4 of the carriers that participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor sailed into the South Pacific, crossed the equator, and met up with an invasion fleet that had left Truk Lagoon had left Guam a little bit earlier. I'll come back around to that in just a minute. So the carrier attack with 4 of the 6 carriers that participated in Pearl Harbor, comprised 109 aircraft, about a third of which were the Zeros, and they went in first on a classic fighter suite. Also with the famous dive bomber, the Aichi Val, and the Nakajima level bomber known as the Kate later on, which in this case, the Kate could carry either torpedoes or bombs, and in this case, they were carrying bombs for level bombing. They pretty well tore up Rabaul that day with that many planes. And the poor guys in the Weiraways, 8 of them got airborne, 5 of the planes were shot down, 2 others were badly damaged, and 1 guy just went and hid in the clouds and waited until the battle was over and then came back and landed. I mean, it was nothing cowardly. There was nothing he could do. I mean, 8 planes against 109, it was useless, and the ones that did try to engage the Japanese were shot down and lost. Now that militia battalion pulled off some remarkable results, despite the fact that they had never fired a shot in anger until the first softening up raids in January. On the day of the carrier raid, they scored a direct hit on the Kate flown by the lead bombardier from the carrier Shokaku. Direct hit, blew it out of the air, it came down and crashed on one of the slopes of one of the volcanoes. They also badly damaged 2 other aircraft, such that one had to be ditched alongside the Kaga, and another, the pilot attempted to land aboard the Shokaku and crashed, killing himself and his backseater. So they ended up, you could credit them with 3 planes, and they damaged others. Their shots were fired rapidly, and they really rattled the formations of these bombers coming in. These were guys who had already hit Pearl Harbor, and they had 1 anti-aircraft battery of 2 guns shooting at them. And some of these guys, their shooting was so accurate that they really shook up some of those crews. It was amazing.
Slide change.
Okay, the invasion fleet that I referenced a little bit earlier. This was created by the Imperial General Headquarters as a composite unit combining both the Navy and the Army in a joint effort. Normally in the Japanese military, the Army and the Navy, much like here in the United States in World War II, was very bitter rivalries, and they didn't play well together. And Tokyo told them to play well together, and this was the result. They had the 4th Fleet under Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, and the South Seas detachment under Major General Tomitaro Hori. They first went to Guam on December 8th or 10th, whichever. I believe the bombing began on the 8th, and the invasion of Guam was on December 10th, just a few days after Pearl Harbor. And they captured Guam in a couple of hours, and they stayed on Guam for the rest of that month, beefing up for the invasion of Rabaul. So on around the 22nd of January 1942, the South Seas detachment crosses the equator. They meet up with the fleet of carriers by Admiral Nagumo from the Pearl Harbor guys, and they send in another carrier attack that morning on the 22nd, just kind of a follow-up raid. And on the morning of the 23rd at 02:30, the Japanese invade. There's a photo of Hori, the commanding general of the South Seas detachment, and a formal photograph of some of the infantry officers in a garden on the island of Shukaku. That's where these guys, the island where this regiment was raised. Not the main island, but the island of Shukaku in the home islands. At 02:30, they made a night amphibious landing right into Simpson Harbor. Pretty remarkable. They had those Daihatsu landing barges and some other landing craft, but they came in and did it under the cover of darkness. They landed 5,000 troops in a matter of several hours. They also had a few hundred special naval landing forces that went in and captured some surrounding areas and also invaded up at Caviang at the same time. So they were taking on that first independent company up in New Ireland while the bulk of the force attacked Rabaul. And despite the best efforts of Lark Force, who had had months to build defenses, the battle was over in just a matter of hours. It was 5,000 invaders versus about 1,500 defenders, and 1,500 men just couldn't defend enough of the harbor. It was 15 miles around, and there's just no way 1,500 guys could defend that much of the waterfront. So the battle was over by about noon or early afternoon on January 23rd.
Slide change.
Interesting photograph from one of the Japanese newspapers of the day showing some of the invasion troops. I believe the guy in the foreground actually has a motion picture camera. I'm not positive of that, but it appears to be a like one of those clock wound motion picture cameras.
Slide change.
The very next day, January 24th, Rabaul is now a target. On the 23rd, it was in Allied hands for the last few hours of being in Allied hands. The very next day, now it's a target. And the RAAF send 5 PBYs from Port Moresby to attack Rabaul and attack the ships in the harbor at night. It's a long flight. It takes them 14 hours to make this trip all the way up. And the reason is that, remember at the beginning I was talking about those mountains, those Owen Stanley Mountains going up to 13,000 feet. The PBY with a full load of fuel, crew of 8 or 9, and 4,000 pounds of bombs on external racks couldn't climb high enough to go over the mountains. So they had to go the long way around, all the way around the Papuan Peninsula, and then up to New Britain, do their attack, and then fly back. Almost at the same time, an effort by the remnants of Lark Force gets underway to try to escape. I don't go into a lot of detail here tonight because of the time constraints, but the Australian government set these poor guys up. They sent them up to New Britain to garrison the island, but they made no provision for recovering them. And even before the Japanese attacked, the government recognized that Lark Force would be, quote, hostages to fortune, unquote, because they refused to send or risk any ships to try to recover these guys when they knew an invasion was imminent. So the guys who hadn't been killed or captured during the invasion had to go into the jungle with what they had on their backs. And if you remember the look on Colonel Scanlon's face when I showed you his picture several slides back, he didn't do his guys any favors either, because he knew they were going to be invaded. He probably could have done a lot of things to help the troops prepare, but instead he sent them out on orders the day before the invasion, telling them that they were going to be on maneuvers for a couple of days and to pack for that. And a soldier is going to do what he's told, and he's going to do the minimum, basically. No slam on soldiers, but if you give guys a parameter, they aren't generally going to go above and beyond in packing their gear. They're going to take what they think they need. And so the survivors of Lark Force end up in the jungle with what they carried. Out of the 1,500, give or take, fewer than 400 were able to get off New Britain after months of just really horrific conditions. Survival in the jungle, you would think there would be food, but actually in the South Pacific Islands, there's very little practical edible food. There's plenty of water, and that was their salvation, but not much food. And also diseases became rampant, especially malaria. So they really struggled, and the individual on the left had lost that much weight in just a matter of months when some 390 were rescued in 2 little movements, one from the south coast of New Britain, the other from the north coast of New Britain, on just these small boats. And you can see how packed that one little boat called the Larabata is. It had about 150 of the troops on it when it went into Port Moresby. Almost 1,000 of the members of Lark Force were captured. Around 900 or so were enlisted, and they were kept in one camp. The officers were kept in another part of the camp, same camp, which had actually been their own army facility there at Rabaul. In June of 1942, because of a sudden food shortage, the enlisted prisoners and a bunch of civilians were put aboard a transport to be taken to Hainan Island. And unfortunately, the submarine USS Sturgeon torpedoed that ship in the middle of the night on July 1st, 1942, and all of the prisoners were locked down in the holds of the ship, and they had no possibility of escape. Just a little side note there that Chester W. Nimitz Jr. was the torpedo data computer officer aboard the Sturgeon and actually set up the firing solution for the 4 torpedoes that were fired, of which one hit the Montevideo Maru and sank it. By this time in early 1942, this is what the Japanese have accomplished. Their southern offensive has captured Guam and you know those outposts for us, for the Allies. They have captured nearly all of New Guinea. Just a little bit of the southern part of New Guinea is still in Allied hands. Port Moresby being the functional capital, if you will, of that area, the main base right there on the south coast of New Guinea. And those Owen Stanley Mountains formed the dividing point between the north coast and the south coast. You know, we still had an outpost there in Port Moresby. At Rabaul, meanwhile, the Japanese come in and accomplish what the Australians just didn't have the manpower or the economy to do. Starting immediately, they came in and they built ultimately millions of board feet of new construction. The red lines around the caldera there are basically showing where they put the anti-aircraft guns. And they literally set up a ring of guns that any attackers would have to fly through to attack Rabaul. They turned it into a modern 21st century fortress. And it was really a remarkable achievement. The development took time. It didn't happen overnight, of course, but they proceeded at a good pace. And so within a year or two, they had set up what you see here with hundreds of anti-aircraft guns and the very stout defenses that are indicated on this slide. In February, the Allies actually make their first attempt to attack Rabaul. And this is just roughly 2 months after Pearl Harbor. A task force is set up surrounding the USS Lexington and a small fleet of support ships. And then there's a plan to send in a group of B-17s that is going to move from Hawaii to Australia. And they're both going to try to attack Rabaul at the same time. That was the grand plan. The fleet, the task force, was discovered on the morning of February 20th, the day before the attack was to happen, by some flying boats out of Rabaul. Once the fleet was detected, Admiral Brown, who was in charge of this, realized that he was not going to have the element of surprise, and he calls off the raid. But he continues heading towards Rabaul for several more hours to see what kind of reaction the Japanese put up. And they did. They sent out 2, what the Japanese would call shotais or divisions of land-based medium bombers that have just arrived at Rabaul. They end up putting out 17 of these bombers. Ultimately, they would have loved to have had escorts by Zero fighters, but the Zeros had just arrived and they didn't have drop tanks yet. The G4Ms, the famous Betty bombers, would also have preferred using torpedoes for aerial attack at low level, but the torpedoes hadn't arrived yet. So they filled the bomb bays up with bombs, and they went out. 17 of these planes and crews went out without fighter escort, and they did find the fleet. They attacked the Lexington, and this was the background of the famous first big fight for the Navy as far as getting in some good shots against the Japanese. And this is where Butch O'Hare earned his Medal of Honor by being credited with, the actual numbers aren't quite as high as originally thought, but he was credited with shooting down 5 of the Bettys and really saving the Lexington. The wherewithal of how this happened is rather complicated. I explain it in pretty good detail in the Fortress Rabaul book. Butch O'Hare basically saves the Lexington and earns the first Medal of Honor awarded in World War II. So that's a Rabaul association, and O'Hare International in Chicago is named after Butch. And the side story about his gangster father is well worth reading about as well. He was a Capone. He was on the Capone team, and was assassinated by Capone's guys for turning evidence with the feds to help put Capone away. So Butch O'Hare's dad, Eddie O'Hare, was a victim of the Capone gang wars. Out of those 17, only 2 Bettys got back, and they had some dead and wounded crew members. So pretty interesting what the Lexington accomplished with its F-4F Wildcats against those 17 bombers. But it also exploited the weaknesses of the Betty. It was prone to burn. And in fact, later in the war, the Japanese crews began to refer to it, in their nomenclature, it was the Type 1 land attack aircraft. That was their nomenclature. Later in the war, they began to refer to it as the Type 1 lighter because it would catch on fire so easily. That B-17 squadron that was supposed to attack Rabaul in conjunction with the Lexington's strike happens to be near and dear to my heart. It was a group of 12 B-17s that departed from Hawaii in mid-February, and they went by island hopping route to Fiji, where they supported the Lexington for the first part of its run up towards Rabaul. And then from Fiji, they went in through New Caledonia at a gas stop and then into Townsville, a town in Queensland in northern Australia. The commander was Richard H. Carmichael, who will figure fairly prominently in this part of the world for a year. He later went on to become a fairly high-ranking Air Force general, and I believe 2 stars, if not 3. And the other individual that I show there is my uncle, John Steinbinder, who was a navigator on one of the 12 B-17s. And I happened to have his diary and some other really great information about the experiences, and had a lot of fun making those part of the Rabaul story.
Slide change.
Back to that same slide. The B-17s were going to fly up out of Townsville and hit Rabaul at the same time as the strike force from the Lexington. But because the Lexington turned back, and because the Japanese launched a very heavy attack on Darwin on February 19th of 1942, the B-17s delayed their attack for a while. In fact, they were so worried that the Japanese were going to attack Townsville that they pulled the B-17s all the way back into the outback in this dusty little town called Cloncurry, about 400 miles inland. But eventually they put together this raid, and this turned out to be the first American attack on Rabaul. They began at night working out of Townsville. They had 9 of the 12 planes mechanically ready to go. They planned to launch around midnight on the night of the 22nd, fly directly up and attack Rabaul, and then fly back to New Guinea and get gas at Port Moresby before returning to Australia. Things didn't work out very well. 2 of the planes collided on the ground in the dark, so that wiped out 2 of the 9. The plane that my uncle was in had water in the fuel. They had there was a particular term that they called, but they had some impurities in the gas and couldn't start one of their engines. So that one was scrubbed. Now we're down to 6 B-17s. They get off, but one of them runs into a big storm front. He kind of gets separated from the rest, and he turns and goes back to Townsville. So now out of the 12 planes, we're down to just 5. They separate into 2 groups. One group gets a little ahead of the other, and a guy named Fred Lewis was the first guy to actually bomb Rabaul. In his flight was a excuse me, he wasn't Fred. In his flight was Fred Eaton in the second B-17, whose bombs did not release on the first pass. And so he made a second pass over Rabaul, took a round through one wing, and then was intercepted by a bunch of Zeros who chased him all the way back almost to New Guinea. And he used up a lot more gas than he realized. Carmichael, with the other three planes, goes in and bombs Rabaul, and they think they've accomplished all kinds of good things, and they think they've sunk a cruiser and done a lot of other damage, but in reality they really didn't do much other than kill a bunch of fish. Now, the plane that flown by Fred Eaton, because he'd used up so much gas, he realized he was never going to make it back over those Owen Stanley Mountains. So he looks for a place to put down off the coast of New Guinea on the north side, and he finds this very promising looking level area. Well, it turns out to be a swamp filled with kunai grass that's 12 feet tall and a lot of water. So they put the plane down. That's how it looked in 1942. The crew all lived. It took them 5 weeks to cross the mountains, 5 weeks, to just go 100 miles to get back to Port Moresby. And they were really emaciated and starved and diseased by the time they made it back. So from the raid on February 23rd, they didn't get back until April 1st of 1942. The plane was discovered again in 1974, and it got the nickname the Swamp Ghost because the seasonal grasses would grow such that the plane would disappear, or it seemed to disappear. And then in the dry season, the water table would recede, the grasses would die off some and brown out, and the plane would seem to reappear. So it was discovered by Australian Army chopper guys in the 70s, and then you can see there how the grass would grow up and partially bury it. The plane was very well preserved. Well, the long story short, it was actually pulled out of the swamp in 2006 by a guy I know well named Fred Hagen, also working with another well-known warbird guy, the Talashe group, I believe David Talashe. And they actually they brought it out in pieces using a Russian helicopter and got it to the docks in Lae. Then they had to fight the Lae government for the Papua New Guinea government for about 3 years. But ultimately it got to Planes of Fame Museum for a while in Chino. Now it's at the, if I've got this name right, the Museum of the Pacific War, or Aviation Museum of the Pacific War on Ford Island. And that's where it'll stay. And it'll be put back together probably in a display sort of the way it was found, because it's kind of too corroded now and too decomposed to put back into flying condition. We're going to turn briefly to the rest of 1942. I don't want to spend too much time on this. I'm going to try to move fairly quickly through this. But you can see with Rabaul in the center of these circles what the combat radius of a Zero happened to be, and the combat radius of the primary bomber, the G4M Nell. The red ring being the Zero, the green ring being the Nell. That's flying out of Rabaul. They also had another group at Kandari in the Celebes, in the Netherlands. So now you can see the combat radius of the air units from there could actually reach into northern Australia. The Japanese wanted New Guinea, all of it, in the worst way. They really wanted Port Moresby. And in early 1942, they captured Lae and Salamua on the northern coast, and they really wanted to get Port Moresby. Because the Allies could still attack Rabaul, even though it was sporadic, from 7 Mile Airdrome at Rabaul. The Japanese, meanwhile, were launching attacks almost every day from Rabaul against Port Moresby and really pounding it. A 7 Mile Airdrome, the harbor area. There were no Australian fighters at Rabaul for aerial defense through the early months of 1942. Lae was captured on March the 8th by the South Seas Detachment, and they immediately began to develop the airfield there. Shortly after that, the Yorktown and Lexington actually launched a very successful airstrike from the southern part of New Guinea, and they hopped over the mountains and caused a lot of damage. But that one raid wasn't enough to stop the Japanese, who kept developing Lae. And then they really started to hit Port Moresby, because Lae is only 125 miles from 7 Mile airdrome. So they could climb right up over the mountains, come right down the slopes on the other side. And in fact, oftentimes the Zeros would come down right down the slopes and strafe before the Australians had any clue that they were even coming. Saburo Sakai, the famous Japanese author of Samurai, was in this group, the Tainan Kokutai, at Lae at this time.
Slide change.
Finally, the Australians get one squadron up to Port Moresby,
Pilots.
75 squadron. They have, what, 25 P-40 Kitty Hawks that have been lend-leased, you might say, not really under that specific name, but by the U.S. Army. And we called them Tomahawks, the Aussies called them Kitty Hawks. It was the early version of the P-40. And for this amazing period of 44 days, this one squadron withstood these Japanese attacks and helped defend Port Moresby. My uncle was there the day the squadron arrived. And on that day, they shot down a Japanese reconnaissance plane. After months and months of being pounded by Japanese aerial attack, you can imagine the relief at seeing some fighters come in and finally shoot down a Japanese plane in full view of everybody. And everybody came out of their foxholes and slit trenches and everywhere else and swarmed the field, and even drove up by truck and lorry and everything else from the harbor to see these Kitty Hawks and congratulate the pilots. Finally, we get some American planes in. I'll cover a little bit about the beginning of the 5th Air Force then. The first American planes were Dauntlesses, of all things, the Army version of the dive bomber. It was never very effective with the Army. They called it the A-24, and just 8 of them from one squadron came up in late March to 7 Mile Airdrome at Port Moresby. Shortly after that, in early April, the 22nd Bomb Group came in with a few squadrons of the B-26 Marauder. And again, these were the early Marauders, the ones that had some of the landing and flight control issues, the one a day in Tampa Bay reputation. That was the early B-26. And they attacked Rabaul on April the 6th, 1942. That was the combat debut of the B-26 Marauder. Ironically, or coincidentally, the combat debut of the B-25, the Mitchell, was that same day, also launched from Port Moresby. They didn't have the legs to go all the way up to Rabaul, so they attacked an airfield called Gasmata on the coast of New Britain with B-25s. But I think it's something almost no one's ever heard of before, that of the 2 famous medium bombers of World War II, the Mitchell and the Marauder, their combat debut was on the same day out of Port Moresby. A little while after that, in the later part of April, we finally get some more B-17s in. Now, the squadron my uncle was in just struggled. They faced dengue fever, malaria. They had no ground crews, so the air crews did their own maintenance. They did their own ordnance as far as loading bombs. It was a real struggle for them, and just to keep the planes flying was a big struggle. But finally, they got some remnants of the 19th Bomb Group, which had been down in South Australia, put back together, and they came up and began to fly some missions out of Port Moresby. At the end of April, the first American fighters come in. These are the P-39 Air Cobras. They had P-39s and a few P-400s. The joke about that was the P-400 was a P-40 with a 0 on its tail. And so they had a few of those. They didn't have good high altitude capability because of the limitations of the Allison inline engine. So they really couldn't compete with the 0 at high altitude. They were okay down at low level, but if the Japanese were flying high, they really struggled. Then we segue right into, as I mentioned, the Japanese wanted Port Moresby in the worst way. and they set up Mo Operation, which was a two-pronged effort to just get a stranglehold on what they called the southeastern area. The capture of Tulagi, which is in the southern Solomons, we'll get to a map here shortly, very close to Guadalcanal, occurred on May the 4th, 1942, and an invasion fleet went around New Guinea to try and around the Papuan Peninsula, or was headed that way anyway, to land near Port Moresby and invade Port Moresby and capture it. A big invasion fleet. Had they accomplished that, I've now added a ring around, I'll actually get to a fourth slide. You can see they have Kendari to the west, Rabaul in the center, and now with the capture of the Tulagi area in the southern Solomons, they intend to build an airstrip on Guadalcanal. And if they accomplish that, that's what the combat radius now gives them. Now they've really started to surround Australia. If they capture Port Moresby, they get this. They get that fourth big base. And now look at the combat radius of the G4M. It covers more than half of Australia. This put the Australians in quite a panic. They established what they called the Brisbane Line. There was really talk of conceding that part of Australia to the Japanese. I don't know if it was seriously discussed by the Army and the military, but the people were certainly worried about it, and the government was worried enough about it that they established what they called the Brisbane Line. The Battle of the Coral Sea then occurs in early May, and I support the notion that it was actually not the draw that most historians call it, but actually a bigger Allied victory than most people give credit, because at Tulagi on May 4th, a strike by the Yorktown accomplished quite a bit, sinking some warships and some minor vessels. The main battle on May 7th and 8th resulted in the sinking of the light carrier Shoho and bad damage to the Shikaku, such that both the Shikaku and the Zuikaku, because of the decimation of their air groups in that battle, were not available for Midway a month later. And then in the ocean Nauru landing areas a few days later, the Japanese lost some more ships. So they lost that many ships versus the sinking of the Lexington on May 8th and a destroyer and an oiler, a tanker, on May 7th. So 3 American ships versus that many Japanese ships. And the invasion was stopped cold. So when you look at all that, I really think it was a much bigger victory than most people realize. Throughout the rest of 1942 is a big war of attrition. The Japanese are entrenched at Lae, just 125 miles from Port Moresby. So almost every day we're sending planes over the mountains, they're sending planes over the mountains. And these guys are just slugging it out. And you can see the cost. We lost a lot more fighters than the Japanese did, but we had more replacements than they did. And so ultimately, we win the war of attrition by being able to replace planes and pilots. The commanding general of the Army air units in New Guinea is not a popular guy, and General MacArthur doesn't like him one bit, mainly because when MacArthur needed to be rescued from the Philippines, General Brett didn't send him the planes he wanted. And so in just kind of a rage, MacArthur just never did like General Brett again. So eventually the morale gets so bad that they bring in General George Kenney, and he really builds up the 5th Air Force beginning in the summer of 1942 by just improving the morale almost overnight. He rewards the airmen for their missions. He does a lot of things to encourage the flight crews to do their job, whereas Brett never even showed himself around the air units. Kenny's aide, Bill Benn, is a well-known pilot. He's given command of the 63rd Bomb Squadron of B-17s, and they actually developed the B-17 as a skip bomber for a time. They used B-17s to attack Rabaul at night from an altitude of about 50 feet. They would come down out of the moonlight with the engines throttled back. They used techniques like using a grease pencil to put a bomb reticle, a bomb aiming point on the windscreen, and they actually did a lot of damage up there. The Japanese really couldn't hear him coming, and they didn't see him until the plane was then full throttle going over the deck, and a moment later a bomb was skipping right into the side of the ship. They accomplished an awful lot beginning in October of 1942. Momentum keeps building as Kenny assigns General Kenneth Walker to head Bomber Command and a guy named Squeeze Wirtsmith to run Fighter Command. And as they get in more planes, the momentum continues to build. They finally get in P-38s, for example, late in 1942, although they don't really get into combat much then. Kenny gets whatever he can get his hands on. He begs and pleads for planes all the time. And he'll take a mishmash just to get planes. One of the gentlemen you'll hear from later was in the service unit in the 5th Air Force and worked on all these planes. Kenny would get an air group of P-47s because early on in the war nobody wanted them, but he took them. He also he created another air group, the 475th. That was a unit that Dick Bong became part of later on. Well, the big problem is that P-38 and the P-47 have nothing in common. So now you got to get spare parts for both kinds instead of picking one and going with just that kind. So there were problems, but Kenny overcame those. And Carmichael, the same guy that led my uncle's squadron, was given command of the 19th Bomb Group, and they really start to hit Rabaul heavy and often. What I'm leading up to, and this is my last slide before we introduce our other gentlemen, is not to really talk about the 5th Air Force in their heyday. 200 more shopping days till Christmas. You can read all about it at your leisure later on. So what I wanted to lead up to is the fact that now we have the 5th Air Force getting solidified. And under MacArthur, the land war starts to move up through New Guinea. Cartwheel then is a 2-year program to neutralize Rabaul. MacArthur and his guys move up through New Guinea, and the famous Bull Halsey, Admiral Halsey, working out of the Solomons down there to the southeast, he begins island hopping throughout 1943 and into 1944, and they converge. There's Rabaul right in the middle. So MacArthur's working up through New Guinea with General Kenny moving his air units in advance. Admiral Halsey is moving from Guadalcanal, which we captured in August of 1942, up through the Solomon Islands towards Rabaul, and they spend 2 years. It takes 2 years to get all this. From the time where I'm leaving off right now, it takes 2 more years. So there's an awful lot to cover and a lot of huge battles. Towards the end of it, in late 1944 and early 1945, some of the air battles over Rabaul itself, where the Black Sheep fought and other units, and where the Black Cats that one of our veterans is going to talk about later, some of those air battles involved as many as 200 Allied attackers and 100 Zeros, just tangling in a big fur ball right over Simpson Harbor. And that happened almost daily throughout the last couple of months of 1943 and the early months of 1944, until finally by about February of 44, the attrition has just worn the Japanese out. They can't keep up the supply lines because we just keep hitting everything they have. With Kenny moving in, Kenny and MacArthur moving in from the south, and with Halsey moving in from the southeast, they've literally just put a ring around Rabaul, and then that's been the title of a lot of magazine articles, was the ring around Rabaul, and they just cut it off. They neutralized Rabaul effectively through air power. And some big battles happened. I mean, I'd love to be able to go on and on about Bougainville and some of the other big battles, some of the carrier raids, but I'll leave that part for another night, maybe. Thank you very much.
What was your first experience with aviation?
My dad took me to an air show in Sheldon, Iowa, and they were giving rides, and this is 1936. They were giving rides in this Ford Trimotor for $1. And that sounded like a pretty good deal to my dad. So I was about 13 years old, and he went over and paid the guy, and I thought my dad was going to go with me, but he put me on. He wasn't about to get on that thing. And so that was my first ride. Then my second experience, other than seeing occasional, very seldom, aircraft in the sky, the word got out that there was a plane that didn't make it. He was going from Minneapolis to Sioux City and ran out of gas right by Lamar's and put it down in the cornfield. And my dad and I went out to take a look at it. And I remember looking at that thing and said, that thing goes way up in the air, you know, and I touched it and I said, man, that's really something. And other than that, that kind of got me started on airplanes. And then I go to the movie and stop in the candy shop and read the pulp magazines about the air wars over in Europe, and that also piqued my interest.
Where were you when you heard about Pearl Harbor and the attack there? Did you even know where Pearl Harbor was?
I'd like to qualify something here. I want to tell you that I was not married at this time. I got married after the war. And when the war started, I was out at a lady friend's place, and she was washing my hair, and it came over the radio. And I didn't know where it was, frankly. But they told me quite a few times.
Okay, let's fast forward to November 1943. Jim is just arrived in New Guinea. He's joining his squadron. Talk a little bit about a PBY. What were the major characteristics of that aircraft? It was called a flying boat or a patrol boat. What was so different about it?
Well, one thing that was different about it was that it was obsolete. It was built in, it was ordered by the Navy in 1937. They paid $90,000 for several PBYs, two consolidated air manufacturers for these flying boats. Now, you have to understand the situation. They didn't have any radar in 1937, and anybody that was going to be on patrol was going to have to use his eyeballs to see what was approaching. There was no other way that was really practical to detect approaching enemies. So they made this aircraft very, very comfortable. They had to keep these people that were crewmen in a PBY. They had to keep them comfortable, and they had to keep them well rested. And that's why we had pretty good sized crews, and we had 3 bunks. We could walk back and forth in these airplanes upright. And I've seen some of these B-24s and B-17s, and I just shudder at how we ever get out of that thing, you know. And so we have a little 2-burner hot plate we made coffee on, and cooked our food on or warmed our food. Most of the food was brought in on a box where it'd be Bancaps, pork and beans, and hot CPO dogs and things like that, and bread. And that would be, because we were flying for a long time. I mean, we'd in our patrols that we pulled in Bismarck Sea, we would get in the plane at about 6 o'clock in the evening, and we would fly until 8 o'clock in the morning. So we had to have food, and we had to have rest also. Now, one of the problems that we used to get into with the Navy bread was that cockroaches really liked it. And at night, if we go back there to take a rest, we had to sweep the bunk off and make sure there weren't any cockroaches there before we laid down. Other than that, there's a few weevils in the bread, but it was a very, very comfortable plane. It wasn't very fast, but it was very comfortable.
And it carried 4 bombs?
We carried 4 bombs. We had, and they were on bomb racks that were attached to the bottom of the wings. The 4 bombs were 2 1,000-pounders and 2 500-pounders, and they had 4 second delayed action fuses, because we were going to use these much like, well, as a dive bomber, you might say. And you can imagine using something the size of a B-17 as a glide bomber or a dive bomber. Our speed was actually a benefit. That's hard to believe, but it was. The Japanese had never seen anything fly that slow. And they couldn't quite see it because it was painted black. And one of the things that we used to notice was they were always leading us way too far. And we didn't try real hard to catch up with it. But seriously, it was. And with those painted black, it was very, very hard for them to see the plane at night.
How many squadrons did you have operating out of your afloat anchorage there that we saw the photo of?
That was only one squadron that was in that bay at a time. But squadrons, we had 4 squadrons that would rotate. There would be one squadron in there. The other squadrons would have duty elsewhere. Big part of our job was to try to pick up the B-25 pilot personnel that were shot down. They were constantly pounding the coast of New Guinea with B-25s, and a lot of those guys would get down in the water, and that's the only way that they could get out of there was if we'd come down and get them. Occasionally a sub would pick up a crew, but most of them we had to go after.
One of your squadron planes, plane number 52, got shot down.
Was 54 was the plane that was shot down, and it had it was our first flight of that rotation. And what happened was they went into look at this was in the St. George Channel, but they went in to look at a small vessel that was in there, and they didn't see another vessel that was there, and that vessel fired at them, and a lucky projectile hit the paraflare in the tunnel hatch, set the other paraflares afire and burned their life raft up. They had 11 men on the plane. They all got out alive, but they were split up and swam for the New Ireland shore, and it was about 24 miles from there. they all made it to the New Ireland shore and began looking for a coast watcher that they knew was there. And unfortunately, they found a native, and he was going to take them to the coast watcher, but instead of that, he turned them over to a Japanese patrol, so they were captured. They separated the officers and the men, and the Japanese beheaded the crew on New Ireland and buried the heads in one grave and the bodies in another. And then they took the officers over to Rabaul, and that's a place we never ever wanted to go to, was Rabaul, because people did not come back from that place that went over there that were captured. And what they would do is they would interrogate them and find out as much as they could from them, and then they would wouldn't be completely through with them, because they would take them up and behead them in front of the other Japanese troops. And that was a way they raised their morale, was watching these Americans be beheaded. And one of the reasons they were so entertained by it is they were so completely frustrated, because they couldn't really get a hold of American, and they were bypassed, and it was a frustrating situation for them, and that's the way they took out their frustration.
On December 9th of 1943, your PBY was able to sink a Japanese freighter. Would you tell us why you were able to do that? Why you were able to locate that merchant ship and sink it?
Right. Well, we the officers were briefed, and they knew pretty much what was happening, and for a good reason. They didn't tell us enlisted men too much about the actual things that were going on. For instance, we didn't know they broke the code, and they didn't want us to know it, because if we got captured by the Japanese, chances are they'd figure out how to make us talk, and they didn't want us to even know what to talk about. So they didn't let us know. But what happened was, a plane would come over, drop the over the bay that you looked at there, drop a canister, and it would have the code that they'd broken, and what ships were coming out of Rabaul, and about where they would be. And this particular ship had unloaded in Rabaul and was going up the coast, the west coast of New Ireland. And they told our crew, we had two jobs that night. One of them was that we dropped 3 bundles to the coast watcher, and then cut over and went up the north on the east coast of New Ireland, and cut across New Ireland, and there was this freighter, and it was just putzing along. It wasn't going very fast. And we simply went into a glide and went across that at about 300 feet, and used the intervalometer and dropped the 4 bombs in train, about 50 feet apart. 2 of the biggest ones, we drop a 5 and a 1,000 and a 1,000 and a 5 with the intervalometer. and the 2,000 pounders hit that freighter and went down to the bottom and went off, evidently, because we turned to the port, and Mr. Lloyd told me to open up, and I strafed the freighter, and he turned the plane the other way to let the other gunner strafe the same ship. And as he turned, and this is about 5 minutes that this all took to get maneuvered around, that ship was going down, and all you could see was a stern sticking up, and that was that we were so amazed at what we had done that it was indescribable. We just were totally flabbergasted that something like that could happen so quick.
Well, 4 days later, you attacked a cruiser, right?
Yeah. Well, what happened was they would encourage us to attack freighters, transports, those type of ships, but they were reluctant to tell us to attack military vessels. And it was up to the pilots as to whether we would attack them or not. And this particular night, we were up in the end of the north end of New Ireland, in a place called Caviang, which is a kind of a small Rabaul, and Mr. Lloyd told me to keep a sharp lookout because we were going to go by the harbor, the Caviang Harbor, which is a pretty active harbor. And he wanted me, because I was on the port side and port blister, he wanted me to keep a sharp eye out for vessels in that area. And I looked down and I saw this. It looked totally different than this freighter that we hit. It was longer and more trim, and I reported it. And he kept on going, and he didn't indicate that he'd even heard me report it. And I thought, well, we're going to bypass that one, I guess. And about that time, he just acted like he didn't even see it. And I think it was a diversionary tactic because he didn't want them to think that he had seen them either. So he went on out and turned, and we were at about 3,000 feet, and he turned and headed right straight down at this thing at about a 20-degree angle. And I was stood up in the port blister, and I could look straight out, and it looked like somebody turned a garden hose on, just a fire. And there was ack underneath, over the top, on each side, and all of a sudden, I was airborne. What he had done, he flipped the stick ahead and as a diversionary tactic, and I lost my feet, went up in the air, and I got back up again and looked out, and still as much fire as ever, and he did it again. And he did this 3 times. I lost my feet. I'm up in the air, and all of a sudden we went across this thing. We dropped, and the bombs all were armed, all went off. But I thought for sure we would be heading up. But instead of that, he kept on going down, and I thought, oh, this is not good. And that was another diversionary time. And there were other ships in the harbor that opened up. and there were shore batteries opened up, and I know they were hitting each other because it had to be, because there were so much crossfire. But he kept on, and when he instead of going up, he stayed down, and the right wing was about 5 foot off the water when he made the turn to the right. And then he was trying to get out, you know, and find some clouds. And we were just lucky enough to do it. But when we went across that ship, it sounded like a bunch of people beating on the bottom of it with a hammer, that there was so much echo.
Well, you were indeed fortunate that you were able to get back. The Japanese weren't the only thing you were fighting. You were twice, you got malaria twice,
Right.
while you were out there. I want to just talk a little bit about how you got back to Iowa.
How I got back to Iowa?
Yeah, at the end, it was in early 1945.
Yeah, we came back to San Francisco, or to San Diego, and we got our got paid, and when we went to get on the train, that we had bought some liquor, and when we went to get on the train, they wouldn't let us on with the liquor, and so what happened was we took the case around the corner. There's a boxcar there, put them in our parachute bags, and came back. And the liquor's grinding together, and they can hear it, you know. So they said, "Well, you got to take that up and put it in the engineer's compartment," which didn't sound very smart to us. You know. And but then they said, "Well, you can keep it back in here in this compartment that on the back of the passenger train there." So we did, and then we heard the Marines, some boot Marines, were singing back there, and we got to thinking, you know, our parachute bags and the liquors in the parachute bags, and we went back there and they'd taken every one of them. So that was the end of that. But then we got out to Los Angeles, and we came up the gangway, and the whole practice squadron was on this train, and we come up there, and this guy would go. You'd say Sioux City, he'd go this way. He'd say Kansas City, he'd go this way, and we're going up there, and we got our seats, and I said, "How does that guy know all that? You know, which door, which train we should get on?" Well, we got out. We got to San Bernardino, and they're checking our tickets, and they said, "You're on the wrong train." There's 3 of us on the wrong train, but he said, "I'll tell you what," he said, "there's another train coming right behind us, and we'll stop and let you off, and he'll stop and pick you up." Well, he stopped, and we got off, and the next train came, and whoosh, he went right by it. So we had to spend the night in the depot there, but then get on the milk train, take the milk train, which stopped everywhere. And in those days, everybody rode the train, not airplanes. And they had a deal with the government where they closed all the bars and everything when the train was in town. Because the servicemen would go in the bar, and then he'd miss the train when the train pulled out. You know. So, but anyway, made it back to Iowa.
This is Jim's air crew on the PBY. Jim, do you want to talk about this?
This is a picture, as you can see, of our plane. It's a PBY, straight 5. and it's pretty much a routine picture that was taken of all the squadrons of aircraft with the personnel. Right here on the front are the three of our three pilots. Fisher. Yeah, why don't you give that to me? Up there? Okay. Ralph Fisher was our second pilot. This is Lloyd, Rudy Lloyd, and Max Hoffines. This was our squadron doctor. He he wanted to have his picture taken with one of the crews, and he happened to pick ours to do it with. Dr. Crawley, he was assigned to the squadron. Now, we have 6 of the 7 enlisted men. Our plane captain was down with malaria that day. But this is Larry Jacobson. He was second radioman. This is myself here. This is a second mechanic. This is Nick Volpe. He was the first radioman. And Saddle Stirrup was a third mechanic, third class. And this was Eugene Au. He was the first ordnanceman in this particular crew. Yeah, let's go on to the next one. This is where we stayed. This is Numoya Bay, and Numoya Bay is right off of the coast. It's about 10 miles from Samurai, which at one time was the capital.
Let's go back here, Jim. I can right there
Yeah.
point out on the beginning
Okay.
where that is.
That is right here is where we were, and Milne Bay was here, and Samurai was right down here, and we were right in here. Okay, this picture is 3 of our planes taken off for patrol, and I'm in this blister right here, right at this time, and I was in plane 48. These other planes are just, these pictures were taken by an Army photographer that came in and shot some pictures that they wanted to, the Navy asked for. This is a picture in Yank Down Under. Yank Down Under is the Southwest Pacific version of Yank magazine. And okay, okay. And what I'm doing right here is putting out a sea anchor. A sea anchor was one of the ways we maneuvered these seaplanes around by hooking the sea anchor to a snub post, tossing it out, and it would pull the plane one way or the other way, depending on which side you threw the sea anchor out. I didn't even know they'd taken this picture, and somebody sent it to my folks, and my folks were the ones that showed me the picture when I got home. This is an article here about the black cats that was in that magazine at that particular time.
I'd like to go back to the one of the harbor.
Okay. Here.
Okay.
And, could you talk about the sharks?
All right. Yeah, the Aussies were looking this place over as a rest camp, and they had a crew in there, and they had got our rearming boat, and they were pulling a surfboard around this island right here. Now this is our tender, and these are our planes that are anchored out in this row here. And what we were doing at night was we always kept guys on the plane at night. There were 3 guys, and we get a little bored, and what would happen would be that they would swim back and forth between these planes to play cards. And anyway, this particular day, I didn't see it happen, but they told about what had happened was they were pulling this guy on the surfboard. That's before they had water skis, and he fell off, and he no more than fell off of that surfboard than a good-sized tiger shark hit him. It just tore his whole front end of him off. And they picked him up they had a tub in there, I suppose they were cooling beer in or something. But they picked that guy up in the tub. He was dead, of course. But it sure put the kibosh to our swimming back and forth.
Thank you, Jim. I want to talk now about Bob and his service. He went to Buckley Field in Denver for aviation mechanics school. Following his training, he went to San Francisco, where he boarded a Liberty ship that was heading west to New Guinea. Assigned to the 389 Air Service Squadron of the 5th Air Force, he worked on all sorts of aircraft in New Guinea. So Bob, what kind of skills do you need to be an aircraft mechanic?
I always was kind of mechanically inclined, working on cars and stuff. So I don't know, I guess. And I my eyes were bad. I couldn't get on a flying crew. My one eye was bad. So the guys that were taking the test and passing, they immediately got sent to down to Texas someplace to gunnery school, and most of them headed over to Europe in the big battle over there. So
What were the typical working conditions at your base in New Guinea? Was it as malaria infested as what Jim experienced?
it was. We had to sleep under nets. Otherwise, the mosquitoes would get you, and at 11 o'clock, when we were at a field called WWII, every morning, 11 o'clock, it would rain, heavy rain, and that saved us. We'd just drop our clothes off and step out of the tent and take a little shower, and that saved us walking down to the main shower.
How did you get spare parts?
Spare parts, sometimes different parts of airplanes. We did heavy maintenance work such as changing wings and changing engines. A lot of parts we took off of planes that were wrecked. We got them out of the boneyard, and we had big supply. There was a big supply place at WWII, and it took so long to get. If we needed an engine for a certain airplane, they had big piles of them there in boxes, and it took so long to go through the paperwork and everything. We just kind of sneak in there and steal one, and the midnight requisition, we call that. And
How long were you in New Guinea?
oh, gee, I never kept track of the time or anything. I don't know. We must have been there at WWII for, I'd say probably 4 months or 5 months. The war kind of passed us by, and we didn't have much to do there anymore. So it was time for us to move. Whenever the airplanes moved up, then we moved right with them.
And you moved to the Philippines? How'd you get there?
We got to the Philippines in what they call LCTs, which were small landing crafts, and we loaded up in all of our gear, and we got out on the ocean, and here along came 3 boats, and they were called LSDs. The LSD, they'd drop the transom on it, and then they'd sink it, and we'd drive the little landing craft right inside of the big boat, and then they'd pump it out, and away we went. And and we always enjoyed, we never fought with the Navy. We always enjoyed getting on the ships because we ate a lot better there than we did on land.
What was the condition of Clark Field in the Philippines, there near Manila, when you got there in October of 1944?
Clark Field was pretty well shot up. The 345th Bomb Group and some planes from the 13th Air Force went over Clark Field. They were strafers. They had, I think they had 14 50 caliber guns that would shoot forward. And they went, they all got together in a big group, and they flew over Clark Field and one way, and then they went around and flew back the other way and strafed that field. Plus, I think the Navy was in there several times, raising Cane there too. And our hangar, a pre-war hangar that we were assigned to there had sheet metal, and that was all full of holes. So the first thing we did is get up there on the roof and put new sheet metal on there. And then when that bomb went off in front, then we had to do that all over again because the hangar was all full of holes again.
What were you primarily doing during the day or night, depending upon when you were on duty at Clark Field? Were you repairing aircraft, or were you, at one point you were driving a truck, right?
I was assigned, I was sent that was in Leyte. I was assigned to what they call detached service, and to another outfit, and I drove a gas truck there for, I'd say about 2 months. And mainly because a Marine squadron came in, and all their ground personnel they were all still out on a ship someplace, and when our main job was to refuel those Corsairs. And
the Corsair was the gull-winged aircraft that the Marine pilots often would fly. It was very good for ground support and close operations in support of the infantry or the Marines.
Yeah.
So when did you go to Ishima off the coast of Okinawa?
That's when we left Clark Field, and we were at Clark Field a long time, and we didn't go till for quite a while. And when we got to Aishima, we really didn't unpack all of our gear, and finally they told us not to unpack anything anymore, and to kind of just sit tight. And I don't know if I'm giving away any secrets or anything, but a guy came in and he briefed us, and this was getting towards the end of the war, and they briefed us, and our next move was going to Seoul, Korea. The 11th Airborne was going to jump and capture Seoul, and we were going to go in there to one of the, there were 3 airports there, we were going to go into one of them, and we never made that trip.
So you were on Aishima when the atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima?
Right. We knew something was going on because all of a sudden they assigned us each a gas mask, and we had to wear that gas. We couldn't even get in the mess hall without a gas mask, and so we knew something was going on, but we didn't know what until we heard about the big bomb going off.
What was the reaction when you and your fellow service squadron mates heard about the bomb?
We were all happy. We figured that we didn't have to go to Seoul, and I often thought maybe we should have gone, and maybe there would have not have been a Korean War. We don't know if that's true or not. But this picture is called, I call it friendly fire. We had a P-38 that was on a mission and had a bomb, a 500-pound bomb hung, and they couldn't drop it. They tried everything. They tried all kinds of maneuvers, and they told the pilot to go up and as high as he could and bail out and ditch the airplane. He said no, he wanted to try and land it. So they flew over the top of our hangar, and they pulled up to fan out to land, and when they did that, the bomb came loose. It went through the roof of our hangar, out the front door, and lit on a V-24. And also there was a string of P-38s there, and one you can see in the picture was already starting to burn, and it was quite a loud bang when that thing went off, and we finally got our wits about us, and there was a whole string of P-38s up there, and we started up there and pushing those P-38s out of line by hand to get them away from that fire, and we lost 13 men in that fire. Plus the pilot of the airplane, he was so low when the bomb went off that it set that 38 on fire. And he finally took it up and did bail out of it, but he later died from the burns that he got from that fire. So that's what I call friendly fire. That picture was taken, has anything to do with Rabaul or anything. That was taken at the Armory at Golden, Colorado, where we spent a little time at the college there, and that didn't seem to go too good, so I finally got back into the Air Force and got through the aviation mechanics school at Lincoln, Nebraska. Good school, learned a lot there. This is a picture of the 2 Jap Bettys that MacArthur had painted, had the Japs paint white with green crosses. They flew, that was the people that were coming down to surrender. They were coming to Manila. We were on an island called Aishima, and the planes landed there, and then they put these Japs on a C-54 and flew them on to Manila. There were 2 of them, and they stayed at Aishima until they came back from, and on the way, when they were going out on the way back to Japan, one of the Bettys rolled off the runway and kind of dinged the landing gear and that, so they had to stay for a while. But all the people, the jet big shots, they got on the one airplane and flew away. So we had the airplane there for a few days. Very seldom, I don't think I've ever seen any write-ups about these two planes and about that trip. It's something that seems to have been forgotten. This P-38 that we rebuilt, it was put up on a pedestal in Poplar, Wisconsin, and in 1950, I believe it was. We went and over there, took it down, took it apart. We took it to the Air Guard base in Duluth and rebuilt it. It wasn't in too bad a shape, but and the engines were shot, of course. It was set out, when they first got it, they put it out in a field for like 5 years. It sat out in a field and people vandalized it so bad they stole the seat out of it. The instrument panel was all broke up. Somebody sawed the yoke off on the where the control stick was. And so we had to rebuild all that stuff, and I worked on it for 2 years, and it was a lot of fun. Met a lot of good guys. We had some good guys working on it. And so I could very highly recommend if you get any of you get near Superior, Wisconsin, stop into that museum and see our P-38.
What was the name of the seaplane tender that serviced your squadron?
The big tenders that serviced us was the Wright and the Tangiers.
We were here tonight to hopefully gain some information. My wife's uncle was Lieutenant John Carlson from Shakopee, who was a B-24 pilot in the Rabaul campaign and ended up getting shot down and had to ditch in the ocean and was killed, but he and his co-pilot both perished, but the other 8 crewmen were able to survive and got picked up by a PBY. And what we're trying to find out is where can we get some information about it. Mr. Gamble has it in his book.
Oh, okay. I was going to look and see if it's in the index.
It is.
Cut me off. Okay.
Sorry.
No, that's all right.
But we don't have any pictures. We don't have anything. Does anybody know of any sources we could try to get some more information?
Was his B-24 in the 43rd bomb group or the 90th? Okay. I'm pretty familiar with that, and my recommendation would be that mission is written up in the squadron's war diary, the operational history, but there really isn't very much information other than pretty much the details that you mentioned. If that's when I remember right, they had run out of fuel. Is that right?
Well, I think they got
With some battle damage.
It was battled. They'd gotten shot up, and then I think they had to break formation. And when they broke formation, they were really attacked by the Zeros.
Right.
And they had to ditch in the ocean.
The B-24, what I can add is that it was the most notorious of the heavy bombers as far as water landings. The B-17, because it had its wing mounted low on the fuselage, was pretty good in a ditching, but the B-24 with the wing up high on the fuselage and that big belly couldn't handle the impact. And that and the construction of the fuselage, the way the bomb bay doors were designed, they had very unique bomb bay doors on a B-24 that went up and down like garage doors. They rolled in tracks, and that was a weak point. So when the pilot would come in a flare, that was the part of the belly that hit the water first, and those garage door type bomb bay doors collapsed and the water flowed in, and then the plane almost invariably broke in half right behind the wing. And the heavy part was the fuselage, the nose with the engines and the main wing. And I believe that's why those two individuals lost their lives, was because of the crush, impact of that, of being crushed and also sinking quickly, whereas other crewmen often had a chance to get out. But if you'd like afterwards, I can try to help you get a copy of at least that page or so from the war diary.
Where is that published? In the bomb group history?
It's not published. You have to be able to know where to find a
Come down
copy of
afterwards.
the group history. In other words, they're on now. They've been digitized. They've been scanned. So at Maxwell Air Force Base, for example, you can get the operational records of the 43rd Bomb Group, but it's actually not been published for a public reproduction. In other words.
Yes, the question was originally asked about how many PBYs were in the squadron, but I don't think the answer was given.
Each squadron was supposed to have 15. However, they very seldom ever could get more than 13 or 14 up because they'd be laid up with various ailments. And when we were each assigned a plane, but if our plane was laid up, then we would fly somebody else's plane.
Also, what was the result of your attack on the Japanese Navy ship?
Well, they went back and looked. They couldn't find it. When we left, it appeared that there was water coming over the fantail, but we don't know. And it's really tough to find out what did happen in those situations.
I understand there was a landing on the western end of New Britain at one point. What was the reason for that, and what effect did that have on the Rabaul campaign?
You're probably referring to Cape Gloucester, the Marine landing there in January of 1944, and that was part of the MacArthur campaign to move ahead and move forward. Really just a pretty bloody landing, very difficult jungle fighting. The National Park Service's retired chief historian, the name of Bears, trying to remember his first name, but it's Ed, thank you very much, Ed Bears, or Bars, sometimes I think his name is pronounced, was badly wounded there and is actually still around and still doing World War II symposiums and so forth, but just a remarkable individual that you could talk all night about one little campaign like that, of course, but yeah, that was Cape Gloucester. It was just part of that pincer movement that was actually under MacArthur's control, though. I think we're getting pretty late on our time.
Let's finish it up, John.
Yeah.
If you have any questions down here, and listen, Bruce, if some of the people here would like some of the books that Axel doesn't have, the Rolling Bookstore from Florida.
I gave him the keys to my trunk already.
Okay. Thank you, and see you next month.
Support for this program provided by viewers like you. Thank you. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.